But yeah, let's take about 15 minutes. And Mo has come with some questions, and that Steve has had some little bit of priming on. And please take it away, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Okay, that was fantastic, Steve. So I think before I start, I think I have to put forward a couple of caveats. I think one, for me as a housing lawyer, I approach housing from a grassroots community perspective. I'm not a public policy expert. I also firmly believe that housing is a human right, and that I think the only way for that to work is that I think we truly have to buy into abolition and anti-capitalism. So, with that said,
it's not a communist revolution.
And I think that's a big problem for me, is that a lot of the solutions and what I see here still has this concept that we need to make money out of housing. And even within that, are we really going to be able to address people who are trapped in a place where they're institutionalized into poverty, and where we have this unlimited amount of rent that people can be charged? Are we really going to be working towards a true solution in the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, good question. Not an easy answer. I mean, I think as long as we are going to have a rental sector, if you're going to have rental housing, you need investors to invest in the rental housing in the first place. How do we find that balance between attracting investment, getting benign investors that are nice landlords and don't charge too much rent, but still can make some a business case for why they do it in the first place? So that's a really tricky place to be on this. I think how we actually decommodify rental housing, I'm not sure we can really do that in our system. But we have to figure out a way to actually find that balance, and I think that's the role of government in terms of regulation. So one of the key issues, probably came from your other questions here, Mo, but the way we regulate the rental market, and the issue that I was talking about the erosion of the relatively affordable stock, is entirely a consequence of rent regulation that has a thing called vacancy decontrol. Before 1998 in Ontario, rental units were all regulated. The unit was regulated regardless of whether the tenant stayed or left. And we had a registry of rents, and rents could only go up by the rent guideline. As soon as we got rid of that, we see these massive increases happening. So I think one thing that we need to do there is think about, can we bring back rent regulation on all units regardless of whether they're vacated? The political response to that, I think there's a few politicians in the audience, probably not received particularly favorably amongst politicians. And I think that's where you sort of, your suggestion that we need a revolt against capitalism. We do need a revolt. I mean, what we need, a third of voters are renters. If the renters could collectively get together, that's a massive movement to say to governments, we need you to fix this problem. The fundamental problem, you only have to do one thing: get rid of vacancy decontrol, and we won't vote for you. If we could create some momentum around that kind of a political campaign to politicize the issue, maybe we can move in the direction that you're talking about, Remo.
Yeah, so I mean, like, for me, when I think about it in my day-to-day, like, vacancy control is, I think, one part of it. And the part that's interesting that I'm looking at your slides, and the part that I wonder about is, you say that we should catch people at the shelter. And I wonder, why isn't policy being developed to catch people even before that? You touch on some of them in terms of increasing OWODSP rates, creating a UBI. I love that as an abolitionist. I love that. But the part of me that I think gets lost is what's happening with the Residential Tenancy Act, which often doesn't get changed probably for 10 years at a time, and is heavily influenced by a very powerful, very influential landlord lobby. And what I'm seeing now is the systematic deterioration of the landlord and tenant board. So I wonder, why is policy not being directed at addressing some of those issues to allow for tenants to assert their rights especially in a place that's so predatory?
Yeah, again, a tricky one. You told me going to these tricky questions. I think there's a difference between having a regulatory framework and being able to enforce it. So if we've got bad behavior, how do you regulate bad behavior? Landlords that choose to issue eviction notices.
Destroy capitalism.
Yeah, well you could do that. We'll come back to that one another time. That's a beer conversation, or many beer conversations. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so trying to regulate behavior is very, very difficult. The other side of that is actually, and I think you guys do a great job of this, but we can maybe do more of it, is educating tenants about their rights. Because I mean, we had a conversation before, and I sort of pointed to the data on N12, N13 eviction notices for occupancy by the owner and for rent evictions. And I said, well, there seems to be quite a low number of these. And you said, well, Steve, that data is crap. It's only when they file that we get that data, and it's all the ones that are issued beforehand. That people are scared and they leave before they even try to contest it. If we could make renters or enable renters to be more aware of the rights that you're trying to protect, maybe it's easier to educate than it is to enforce your regulations on the other side.
Yeah, in that sense, I think this is the part which I hate about policy, is that there's this assumption that policy and law works in an equal footing. There will always be a power imbalance. I think especially when you look at low-income renters, students, international students, migrant workers, saying that we know our rights is very different than are we able to assert our rights, especially when you're desperate to keep a home over yourself. For me, and it's interesting that today's International Women's Day, and forgive me if I get quite emotional about it, is I recently had a tenant. She lives in city housing, and then had to leave it because of a domestic violence issue. Went into a unit that was deplorable, but that's all she can afford. And now she has a landlord that came to her that said to her, if you don't sign this N11, I will kill you. So she stood up to him, and then he came back and said, if you don't sign this N11, I will rape your daughter. So she signed it and lost her home. And I think as much as I can empower her, as much as policy can empower her, I think in a system that rewards predatory behavior, we lose that sense of humanity. And I wonder, does policy forget about that sometimes, about what it's really like out there for poor people, what it's like for women, what it's like for marginalized people? Because when I read policy, I think it misses that humanistic element.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about market failure, we can talk about policy failure as well. And, not all policies can be effective and work. But again, I mean, there have been attempts to put in place, various regulations to prevent that from happening. Yet it still happens. Is that a policy failure? Is it an enforcement failure? It's a very, very sad case, and I feel very sorry for your client. I don't know that policy could actually do much to make a difference.
Yeah, and that's the thing about it. When I look at some of this, and I think some of this research and this policy, I think will have some impact, but the inherent issue is that we still are looking to make money off housing, and I don't know if policy can ever solve that issue unless we take away the idea that we need to generate wealth from money. And I just recently read an article about fractional housing investment, and thinking about that, just it made my heart drop, because I'm thinking, not only are REITs horrible, but now let's get small bro Andrew Tate people into housing now to further marginalize people. And when as many houses, we can build all this stuff, but I don't know if even, and I wonder, do you know the devil that you're trying to deal with when you're making this policy?
Well, yeah, but as I said, in a liberal market capitalist sort of system, short of fundamentally changing the system, which I know you'd like to do, I'm not sure how we can. It's a great aspiration. We have, that's the system we live in. That's the system we kind of have to work with. And regulation policy tries to manage that system and address its warts where it can, but it can't address all these kind of issues. I think one of the interesting sort of things around in sort of the new you know, housing is a right. Human rights have been around for a very long time, since the 1948 International Declaration. We've only seen them embedded in legislation in Canada since 2019, so it's a new space for us. But the whole notion of housing, the right to adequate housing, it's not about an individual's right to have a place they can afford and be safe in. It is, but it's not specifically that. It's about putting an obligation on government to create a better, healthier housing system that enables them to achieve those outcomes. So it's a systems change rather than doing things that help the individual household. Now, if we can create a better, healthier housing system where we have a larger group of benevolent landlords, an expanded non-market sector that has already essentially decommodified the property that they're looking at, an expansion of land trusts that can hold properties without the desire to generate profits. I mean, that's not going as far as getting rid of capitalism completely, but it's trying to edge a non-market model and make it bigger within a market system. And that's probably as much as we have to do.
Yeah, and it troubles me because I want to see things move in that direction. And I look at your research, and I know that from a practical sense, this is probably not going to happen for at least 20, 30, 40 years, if that. I wonder, spitball for me, what amount of, so I think the last time I checked, the National Housing Strategy and the federally, I think it's something like under 2% of the federal budget is actually committed to housing.
Yeah, right.
And I think about the province, which they don't like to. They've downloaded that now to the city. The city's budget. I mean, I think they can do what they probably can do. I think they could do more if they're willing to be brave. City Housing Hamilton, I think the budget is something around 60 million. What type of number really do we need to commit to federally, provincially, and municipally to really actually tackle this problem?
Yeah, I mean, there was a campaign created by a bunch of folks in Toronto, much up by David Olchanski, 20 years ago, which they labeled it the 1% solution. And at that time, and I think you're being generous in your estimates there, Mo. I think total housing expenditures of federal and provincial governments as a percentage of total program spending is less than 1%. So they were arguing for doubling that 1% to 2%. So we double the current level expenditure. Right now, I think together they're probably spending in the order of $3.5–4 billion a year. So $8 billion a year in a federal budget that's, I don't know, how much, about $280 billion, I think. So yeah, it's a very small increment if we look at it from that point of view. Department of Finance may have a different view because they look from the bottom up.
Well, can we go to the floor?
Oh, yeah.
Can we take some questions from the floor?
Yeah.
This has been fantastic. I think that's a good place to actually transition to a question from the floor because, yeah, it is a big picture question. What should we be spending if not? And thanks so much for the fantastic questions. I think they're ones that we really do have to confront. And in the interim, we have to do the best that we can with the solutions that we can provide from the data. So it was really fantastic. Maybe we have time for a couple of questions from the floor if anybody wants to speak up and. Joey.
So if the government gets into financing the purchasing of existing buildings, we still have the challenge of what Quantum would call tower renewal. How do we finance the renewal of that rental stock?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, we built most of our rental housing. I'll probably stand up, it's easier. We built most of the rental housing in this country in the sort of 60s and 70s, so it is 50 years old now, particularly that built form of the towers, and it is in massive need of renewal. There are a number of programs in the National Housing Strategy. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities has a program about retrofit, and I think with increasing attention to environmental issues and greening, many of those programs are being associated with, okay, let's do a retrofit and do an energy retrofit at the same time, which actually is beneficial for tenants because fuel utility poverty is a big piece of this as well. So a large part of that infusion probably should go to actually fixing up that existing stock, making it more energy efficient. As much as we like to build new, it's probably cheaper. We can spend $20,000–$30,000 a unit to bring those units back up to better condition and better performance compared to 300,000, 10 times as much to build new. So absolutely, if I was the Minister of Finance and I had to choose, I think I would err on the side of improving and expanding the existing stock.
Anyone else?
I'll never be the Minister of Finance, by the way. And nor were you.
The guy can dream. No, definitely not. The guy can dream. Other questions for Jeff?
Yeah, sure. So this was marvelous. So thank you both for the presentation. I'm wondering, Steve, if you can comment a little bit about the construction side of things, and the way that that's impacting the cost of doing business for even like tower renewals, with the way that the cost of construction labor has gone up, it puts some real constraints on even basics. How does that change?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real challenge. I mean, costs have gone up across the board, of course, during COVID, partly because of labor constraints, partly because of material constraints. Some of those are now, the pressure's coming up a little bit. The supply chains are opening up, that kind of thing. I think the bigger constraint is on the labor side, and I think trying to, we got a bunch of young kids, coming through school, figuring out what they're going to do for a career, and everybody's telling them go to university and get a degree. You can make $100,000 as a plumber, as an electrician, as a joiner. We need to think about expanding our vocational training for our young adults that are thinking about where they go in the labor market, and actually replace a lot of those. I mean, the labor costs have gone up because of a shortage of labor, of retiring. All the trades were, a bunch of Europeans that came here after the war and are all retiring now. How do we replace them? If we're raising these immigration targets, I would actually specify in those immigration targets those kind of skill sets that are going to help the construction industry, and build from the bottom at the same time by massively expanding our high school programs that get kids into the trades and get them into the apprenticeships in community colleges and that kind of area. Not an overnight short-term solution, but I think if we think about creating a healthier, better system in the long run, investing in giving them good jobs, so they can actually afford to pay the housing they live in, as well as building housing for other folks. This is one way to think about it.
Please go ahead.
On the vocational side, I remember back in the 60s when I was in high school, my school became vocational. It didn't really work. It didn't really work. My question is about a slide you didn't show, but you'll be showing tomorrow, and that's the one about the very low amount of money that the city of Hamilton's gotten from the federal government for construction of new units.
Right.
We trail Ajax for epicentres.
Right.
What's the reason for, is it a problem on the Hamilton side that we can't put projects forward fast enough, or is it a problem on the federal side?
Well, it's both. I mean, there's not enough money in the federal overall envelope anyway, and it's very competitive. Having said that, those are the municipalities, and I don't want to be critical of Hamilton, but I think they have been more proactive in pursuing that funding. They saw it was out there. It's not allocated to any particular jurisdiction based on any kind of per capita share. It's simply out there, first come, first serve. In other areas, and it wasn't just the municipality, perhaps it was because they had a very active community housing groups. In Ottawa's case, they got a pile of money, 187 million, because they put together a comprehensive 10-year renewal plan for their Ottawa community housing stock. Were able to pitch the federal government and say, look, don't do this one project at a time, give us portfolio funding. And certainly now in the discussions that the city is having on their roadmap, how to support the housing homeless action plan, I mean, I think they are now having that conversation about how do they actually emulate that behavior and make sure Hamilton catches up with those other municipalities and gets its so-called fair share of those federal dollars.
We just got a name for it too. We call it the Ajax Challenge. From this point forward, right?
There we go.
We want to match the Ajax proportion. Let's go ahead.
I'm just curious about, we have kind of a very aging rental stock, and we do have a lot of renewal of things that need to happen. And a lot of our, 90% of our purpose-built rental housing was built over 40 years ago.
1980, about 80%, yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Will do, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is there opportunities for us for rental construction? I think we're seeing a lot of international students and, I guess, new migrants would most likely enter the rental market first.
Yeah.
Um,
Let me repeat. Yeah, I got the question. I'm just going to repeat it so everybody can hear it. So aging rental stock, 80% of it was built before 1980.
Yep.
And so what can we do to spur rental construction because of this aging rental stock?
Well, there's two things. The first question was, can they actually do something to fix that up? Second is, can we augment it with new supply? I mean, I think we have seen a significant market response to because rents have come up, as I mentioned, nationally, a quadrupling of the rent construction in the last 4 years. So the industry and the developers are thinking, okay, yeah. And what you saw happen for 20 years was multi-residential, multi-apartment builders. They said, the rent sector is just too regulated. The rents are suppressed by rent control. We're not going to build that anymore. But we still want to build. So they went and started building condos. So they built condos for 20 years, and they turned around and they found that 35-40% of the units they were building were being purchased by individual investors who were becoming rental landlords and renting them out. So the indirect form of rental supply was not by people building purpose rental, it was by building a tenure neutral building. You came along and you bought a unit to live in. I came along and I bought a unit as an investor. So all of a sudden, I think in the last few years, the development industry has woken up and say, holy smokes, these folks that are buying from us, they're getting rent at $2,500 a unit on this. This actually makes sense for us to start building rental now. So they have already started to do that. The federal government has tried to stimulate them more through a very low rate financing program. That was supposed to help expand rental supply. The data I looked at, about 8% of all the units funded in the last 4 years have actually been funded by that particular program. The fact that 92% didn't use that program suggests that the market is actually doing a pretty good job of setting signals to say, look, guys, you can make money, and no one will like it. They're going to charge $2,500 a unit, but they can make money doing that, and they are. Now, that said, the other piece that I sort of touched on very briefly was, we want more rental supply. Ideally, we don't want to do $2,500 a unit, even though that unit will help the vacancy rate. If we build 1,000 units, the vacancy rate in Hamilton will go down by 2%, or improve by 2%. But this point I made about the non-profit sector building those units, can they actually go in there and build units at something less than 2,500, maybe 1,500? Still 110, 120% of the market rent, but they'd be building it into a system which is decommodified. And so how do we actually grow that part of the stock? Now that's where, I had a conversation with the federal minister on this, and I said, Minister, who's saying what you need to do is take the RCFI money, because right now you've got a really stupid, bad definition of affordability in there, and it's not creating any affordable housing whatsoever. Change that program and direct that funding to non-profits that are willing to build at these moderate rents. I said, that's a brilliant idea, thanks very much. Haven't seen you since.
That's terrific. Thanks so much for those great questions. Thanks, Mo, for the fantastic questions. I think the answer to your wishes is that yes. Well, first of all, your underlying analysis is that we've been far too based on a market system. We've had a blind faith in markets to actually deliver housing broadly to the population, and I think coupled with a whole bunch of underlying forces, that's actually not really come true. So rising income polarization, changes in deinstitutionalization in the 1960s, right? We had a whole host of people for whom their housing was met in that way, which, and now, and for moral reasons, we underwent deinstitutionalization, but now, and the promise was there'll be housing and supports for people in the community, and that was never really delivered upon, precisely because it's something that's profitable from a market perspective. But I think, one of the things that comes out of Steve's answers repeatedly is this, at least a gradual, what we can do in the short term is at least a gradual transformation of the sector from this profit-based, market-based to more non-market housing. And many of the people who are doing that on a day-to-day basis are actually here in the room today. So I'm really thankful for that. So just to wrap up, we're going to ask Julia Woodhall-Melnik from the University of New Brunswick to give 5 minutes of reflections and thoughts on how research can inform housing policy based on her experience. And welcome, Julia.
Sure. Hi, folks. So I'll keep this really brief. I know we're sort of running a little bit over time. Mo, you might be my new favorite person. I am also a very strong, what do I call myself, a ranting socialist. So very awesome. And Steve, you're famous for your work in the city of St. John, so it's an honor to follow you. So just within the context of where I'm living now, I have to say I was born and raised in Hamilton and moved to New Brunswick 5 years ago before it was cool. And we actually have seen a lot of movement of people from other provinces out to where we are because of the affordable housing divide. But we also live with a whole population that experiences a host of intergenerational poverty, economic inequality concerns, who are now experiencing just being absolutely obliterated, priced out of the market that was once very affordable for them to actually become homeowners and build equity. So that's a big thing that's happening. We've seen massive house price growth and a 1.9% vacancy rate, and it's 0% in some rural areas. We also had our residential tenancy agreement and act is highly influenced by landlords as well too, where our recent landlord lobby actually misappropriated CMHC data, which they fed to our housing minister, which she then used to not continue our experimental rent cap. So, my lab caught that, which was nice. We had some good times with CBC. So anyway, right now we have sort of a dearth of tenants' rights legislation, and it really is a REIT paradise. We've been called in the press a REIT paradise, and we've seen an 11% growth in REITs just the past year alone. So we're seeing a lot of this as well, and we're a poor city, but we also harbor some of the country's most wealthy families. Specifically, I think of an oil family that pays less on property tax for their refinery than any other large refinery pays across North America. So we definitely have the money that can be redistributed through our system. And this is what I think about when I think about research and policy informing the policy that we have today. I think it's important to take a look at what's going on in the market as it is now. So Steve, presenting information about students moving here, that makes me start thinking, okay, what is the responsibility of the university system, of the college system, of the trade school? Should they be stepping in and saying, if we want a large amount of international student tuition, we're going to have to start building residences. So the last sort of there you go. So a few things that I really picked up on here as well too was just this discussion about can we or can't we? Is kind of the tension that I saw between Mo and Steve. And really, I do view it as a lack of political will in terms of not imposing a wealth tax on some of these ultra wealthy families that we do have, or I say families because I basically live in an oligarchy. So we'll call them individuals here. So not imposing a wealth tax on them, and then systematically tracking this wealth tax and seeing the good that it can do for individuals. The only thing that has touched we had at one point a 95% child poverty rate in one of our most poor neighborhoods. The only thing that has brought that down to, I believe, around 35% now is the Canada Child Benefit. So, there's a lot of good income redistribution programs that we can draw on as researchers to help make those policy frames and advocate for certain things. So last thing I will say, and then I will let you guys all go on to your evening. So I really see this as a now issue and a tomorrow issue. So really, when I look at housing, I think, okay, we're in dire straits now. We have screwed up for so many years to the point now where we just can't continue where we are. Environmentally speaking, affordably speaking, from a human rights perspective, we can't continue to do what we're doing. But also Steve very astutely brought up that it takes time to build housing, right? So we need contractors, we need supplies, we need things to work in our favor. So what do we do now while we wait? And probably the saddest thing that I did a couple weeks ago was with one of my city councilors, the deputy mayor of St. John, we ran a seminar on secondary suite. So how to actually carve out extra space in your home to house somebody. And it was something that if you would have asked me 5 years ago, would you advocate for people doing this? I would say no. We need to like put pressure on the government to deliver more affordable options. But, you know, here we are. So, you know, options like that and tracking to see, you know, what is happening and what creative solutions people are bringing together is really important. So we can do things like, you know, offer nonprofits right of first refusal, cancel Airbnb, that would be a great thing. Other things, you know, stronger tenants' rights protections. These are all things that can happen without a shovel in the ground. You know, wealth tax, that would be great. When I look at the tomorrow, I would really like to see robust social programming that works for the people who actually need it and not the people who really don't, like kind of myself. Anyway, so, you know, these are a few things that I think about. And the last thing that I kind of leave on a question about, and this is more for Steve, and maybe Steve and I can have a conversation about this later. I worry a little bit about housing benefits, just because I worry that we might be subsidizing REITs and the wealthy with our tax system. So I worry a little bit about that, and we'll, yeah, maybe we can go into that later. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for attending this afternoon, tonight. Really appreciate you spending this time with us, and really want to thank Steve for the talk, Mo for moderating the discussion, and for Julia for the comments. I also want to thank the powerful CHEC team, Kim Langil, who was on the tech, Lindsay Goddard, who put everything together, Brad Honeywell, who's not here but is on the other side of the tech remotely, and lastly, Cynthia Belaski put a huge amount of work into this. She's the managing director of CHEC, and you would have received actually emails from her inviting you to this event. She's fantastic. She couldn't be here tonight, and really want to thank everybody, and thank people from the city of Hamilton who have helped organize some of the other activities that Steve's been engaged in today and tomorrow. And look forward to seeing you all as this conversation continues. So thanks again. Thanks for being here.